Welcome to Reading for Life. My name is Julie Kleinfelter, Director of the Public Library in Austin, Minnesota, and I'm here today to talk about the book The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, a novel originally published in 1945. The purpose of Reading for Life is to grow community around a shared love of literature. The core idea is that works of literature offer precious resources of energy and vision for the creation and sustenance of healthy communities. Reading for Life leverages this unique resource to grow community from the inside out, to link imagination to imagination in an ongoing conversation about the concerns we share and the aspirations we harbor. It's educational and entertaining in the richest sense of both terms, a living classroom as wide and deep as our collective spirits can imagine. With me today is my co-host, Michael Verde, who founded Reading for Life in 2005. Hello, Michael.
Julie, good to see you. Happy to be here.
We're back at it again.
Yes, we are. It's so fun to talk to you and to be able to talk about books in ways that maybe in high school or in college you get maybe a great professor or teacher, and that really sets the standard for what's possible with books. And then after that, you probably spend a large part of your life, if you're a dedicated reader, looking for that experience again, including probably going to book clubs, etc., and finding I'm just imagining, largely disappointment that these other conversations didn't live up to the one where you thought, oh my gosh, I'm falling in love with books. So the fact that we can try to approximate those make-believe conversations and make them come alive for people in your community, that I think is a lot of fun for me, and I hope for the people that follow us.
Yeah, I hope so too. Yeah, I think that idea of, trying to have those deep conversations around novels, it's kind of a hard thing to create on your own. So this is where we're kind of hoping to help with that a little bit. So with Catcher in the Rye, we've been talking a lot about reading great works of literature with that focus on the book themselves, not necessarily our interpretations, but the actual words. I know we've talked a lot about the very specific words that authors pick and why they pick them. And that's one of the things that we kind of start a lot of our conversations with. And one of the first things that I noticed about this book when I was kind of rereading it was there's a lot of animals. And in particular, Holden, he talks a lot about ducks. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what's up with the ducks. Holden is very concerned about ducks in this book.
Yeah, wonderful. And speaking of animals, I think the cover of the book that you're holding right now has a horse on it.
Yes.
And you can imagine that if you're doing the cover art for anything, that you're really trying to capture the essence of what follows in an image or a symbol. So the fact that there's a horse there on the cover, and the fact that this conversation with the ducks recurs in multiple instances in the novel, as you mentioned, both of those things, the common factor is an animal. And so what are we to make of these animals? And let's begin with the horse and circle back to the ducks. The book ends with Phoebe on a horse going around and around. So
On the
that's
carousel. Mm-hmm.
yeah, there you go. So there's another example, specifically there of the horse. Well, okay, let's hit pause for just a second. And one of the things I want to say about the way literature communicates, or let's say fiction communicates, unlike the way other kinds of writing communicates. So a book on history, a book on philosophy, or the newspaper, etc. Fiction communicates with a different kind of logic. And the logic is the logic of myth and metaphor. Now, the logic of ordinary writing is the logic, let's say, of grammar and reference. I know what this sentence means if I can grammatically get it and know what it's representing. In other words, what it's a sign of. That's how ordinary language means. Fiction means with a different kind of logic. And the two sort of elements of that is myth and metaphor. And I'm saying all that. We're going to get back to the animals, but I'm setting up why. The way myth makes logic is by moving things to opposite ends. Myth, in other words, divides the world into contraries. This is the way myth makes sense of things. And the contraries are typically a world that is above, as in better in some way, than the quote unquote real world. And the opposite of that would be a world that is beneath the real world and in some sense worse, we might say, than the real world. You can take, for instance, just a classic example of the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve are in the garden. It's a blissful place to get kicked out, and now they're in east of Eden, and this real world is beneath Eden. And you could think even beneath the real world would be a place called hell, and even above Eden would be a place called heaven. In other words, you could set those four, that story has four worlds, and they're vertically sort of oriented to each other. And our imagination gets that even if we're not conscious of it.
Mhm.
So, in any case, myth gives us, divides the world into contrary, and it also gives us a vertical axis that we can, from which we can see our own world. If we didn't have a point of view either above our world or beneath our world, we wouldn't have a picture of our world. We would be too much in the picture to see it. You have to get out of the frame in order, in other words, to see the picture. And if you imagine we're trying to catch a glimpse of our world, well, that's what myth does. It takes us out of the world far enough and gives us multiple perspectives above it and beneath it. And you can think of different genres as focusing either on the above it, as say a comedy or romance, or beneath it, as in say a tragedy, excuse me, or satire. Okay, so myth separates the contrary worlds, superior or inferior to the real world, or what we take the real world to be. And that's how myth makes sense. So let's go back to animals and imagine what, if we're thinking mythically now, or thinking like myths do, what could be the opposite of animals? One thing we could think of is that animals are natural. Animals are in nature. So what would be the opposite? I'm just thinking out loud now. It's not a math thing where you can go to the back of the book. We're just thinking out loud with images. So what would be the opposite of something natural? Well, one thing that could come to mind is something that's spiritual. We often think of spiritual as opposite of natural. Or we could think of it in the other direction. Opposite of natural would be something that was fake or artificial. And you see how in both of those instances, you could imagine it in some sense less than natural, or as we say, supernatural, as in more than natural. So that's a way we can begin to make sense of these animals, is think how is this book playing with things, excuse me, that are natural or not natural? And what is the book, showing us through images? It's not telling us anything, but it's giving us images, and it's giving us images in a kind of structure that we can get a picture of things. So a way to think about the opposite of natural, and in way that the book thinks about it, is a museum. Now, isn't this a wonderful example? And what museum is it? It's very specific about what museum it is. It's the Natural History Museum. There's the nature, there's the history. But if you add museum to nature and history, look at the weird thing that happens. Now, we're going to use our imagination here, but notice that we're working with the world's natural history museum that comes from the novel. We didn't take Natural History Museum and put it in the novel to try to explain the novel. The novel gives us Natural History Museum. We can either pay attention to those words, or we can just say, okay, that's a museum. It happens to be that one, which of course is a good way to miss a novel, speaking of things that we miss. But if we look at those things, nature and history and museum, you can almost see a picture of nature and history. That would be time and space, material world and time. And a museum would be material world and time as it's encased or enclosed in a container, a glass container. Now, this gives us something to contrast to animals. In fact, he even mentions, of course, seeing one of the ducks. They have the ducks in the museum, but they're hanging ducks. So these ducks don't go anywhere. But these ducks don't die either. These ducks don't have to worry about food, but they have achieved this ease or absence of anxiety about food. They've achieved it at a very high cost. I mean, we could all get over our anxiety about food by just going on and not being alive. Then we wouldn't have a food issue. Okay, I'm playing with this because the book really is too, right? The Holden is really, really not comfortable with a world where people die, where things change, right? Allie, a world where your little brother dies for no reason whatsoever, a world where people write FUCK on school property, on school grounds. I mean, there's a world with a bunch of phonies, a world that is imperfect. is something that Holden is just rejecting, right? So one way you can reject that stuff is make up a make-believe world in your head where everything is perfect. Now, what do we have there? That's an image of a museum, wouldn't it? If we all have little museums in our head where everything is perfect, and the one problem would be it's just not alive. And if we try to live there, what's going to happen? We're going to be out of touch with people that aren't in our head inside the little snow globe.
Right.
So this, I think, is one way to begin to think about these animals, is that they are preferable to stuffed animals. So that's a good thing. That's moving towards life. They're more
Mhm.
alive than the stuffed animals. However, things in nature do die. Things in time, it's a natural history museum, right? Things in time and things in nature die. So in that sense, a part of us doesn't isn't comfortable with that. We just can't accept, our imagination can't anyway, that we have to die, even if we know we are. I think Ernst Becker wrote a wonderful book called The Denial of Death, and really how it's just not acceptable to us to imagine our own extinction. So could there be something superior to nature, excuse me, that wasn't actually going backwards into artificial? I mean, the museum is a solution to nature, but it's going backwards. Could there be another solution that includes the absolute reality of nature, which, with all the heat, the touch, all the great things about the natural world, that doesn't end in death? And one way to think about that is to think of the ending in the novel, because in this moment, there is this horse going what? Around and around. Well, that's what time does. That's what nature does. It goes around and around. But we don't want to just go around and around and disappear. We would hope that going around and around could, something could happen in all those revolutions that did not disappear. In other words, we have an opportunity in this body material world to either experience something or to create something that is not going to die. And one of the things that happens in this scene is that Holden all of a sudden has a breakthrough, right? He says, regarding watching Phoebe, that she's gonna reach for the ring, the golden ring. He knows she's gonna fall. This is something that he ordinarily wouldn't accept. He'd run and hide in the museum of his head. But now he's realizes you've got to let him fall. And then, and speaking of images, all of a sudden now it starts to rain. His deer hunting hat, or people hunting hat, as he explains to Ackley, is partly protecting him, but not entirely, which means the water's touching him. He's not entirely in a museum. This is good. This is a breakthrough. He was in the museum of his head, but now he's actually outside and the water's touching. In other words, this really is a breakthrough moment for Holden. This, in some ways, is the climax of the book, where Holden comes out of the museum in his head. He's in the natural world, but then in the watching this, he has a kind of vision that gives him peace of mind, that there was something here that wasn't all futile. This is why we experience that ending as a kind of a climax, because there's a breakthrough in Holden's consciousness. And then what is the last sentence? He says, God, I wish you could have been there. And we can read that one or two ways. We can read it as a throwaway line, as speaking to the reader, for instance. God, I wish you could have been there and seen what I saw, and not think twice about the sentence, which would be unfortunate given that it's the last sentence in the next to the last chapter that in many ways is the climax of the novel. If you don't pay attention to the first sentence in a novel and the last, or essentially in this case, the last, or one of the two last sentences, you probably should change your reading habits. So let's pay attention to that sentence and think of, is there another way we could read it? And I think there is. God, comma. When we have a comma, we use that to address someone. In other words, Julie, comma, give me a call. Okay, God, comma. Okay, what does it say in that way? If we read it that way, I wish you could have been there, would be of saying, God, I wish you could have been there. The irony being that in a way, God is there, But it's not the God, the museum God up in the heaven, which is, say, outside of natural history. This is a God that is in time. In other words, we're experiencing eternity, but in time. We're experiencing, in other words, a vertical dimension enters into the horizontal, and all of a sudden we see that there is more to nature than just a bunch of FUCKs and then you die. There is this opportunity for beauty. This is opportunity for love. In other words, there's an opportunity for experiences that transcend time, but you're alive when it happens. You don't wait until you're in the museum, or you don't wait till you're dead for it to happen. This is happening in time. Now, the cost of that, of course, is all the things that happen negatively in time, but that's the cost of this transcendence. That is a really wonderful way to think about the animals, because it's, I think, giving us a vision that there is something in some sense that is more than nature, but it's not outside of nature. We are animals, but we're somehow something more than animals. But if we get rid of our animalness, which is what Holden has really kind of done, right, by locking himself into a museum world, if we get rid of our animals, we're going backwards. But if we just stay animals, well, then we're just going to go round and around, and it's going to really be something that's a failure too. So how do we take our animalness, you might say, and transform it into something that includes the animal, but that brings the animal into another dimension of experience in which death doesn't get the last word, or which, in this case, nature and history aren't the end of the story? There is something else we could say called eternity. But again, notice it's not eternity in a museum eternity. And now, what does that tell us about those mummies? You see, all of a sudden, the mummy becomes a great symbol of something that's going to achieve eternity by being dead, wrapped up. Okay, a mummy, this was the idea that the Pharaoh here was going to go to the next world and not die. So you wrap this, in other words, this whole mummy project is an effort at immortality. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of what this book is working out. Is there a kind of immortality that is not the fake immortality of a museum? This is strong stuff, and but it never says that, does it? But what it does is it shows us images in a structure, and this takes us back to myth and metaphor. We started saying that myth puts everything in contrary worlds, above and beneath the quote unquote real world. And then the other way that logic that fiction makes, unlike the newspaper history and biography or whatever, is metaphor. It speaks in metaphor. And what does metaphor do? It does the opposite, really, of myth in some way. It brings things that are supposedly two things and makes them one thing. Metaphor brings things together that in ordinary consciousness can't be brought together. It's a different kind of consciousness. Actually, the metaphor says actually two things can be one. And if you think how important that is to us, imagine what every marriage would be. Traditionally speaking, you're going to become bone of bone and flesh of flesh. You're going to wed your bodies together. Now, if we imagine that in a literal way, it's a little anatomically discomfiting. I mean, this is Siamese twins kind of things. And that's obviously what we're not going for. But we nevertheless must also not think that we're just going to live two independent lives and share the refrigerator. I mean, that exactly isn't a marriage either. So how do we get a marriage that's not anatomically inconvenient, but that is also not just economically convenient? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, well then this brings us into what a spiritual wedding could be. That we could actually be, spiritually speaking, bone of bone and flesh of flesh, meaning that the food in the refrigerator is our food, but not for that reason be joined at the hip with super glue. In other words, metaphor makes possible our imagination of something as commonplace as marriage. Well, a marriage is a way of thinking metaphorically, really, that two people can become one. So I'm thinking now of myth and metaphor. This is how fiction makes sense. So how does that pertain to the novel? Well, you mentioned Holden is preoccupied with those ducks. If we're thinking metaphorically, then Holden can be one of those ducks. And now all of a sudden the conversation about where the ducks go in winter starts to take on a whole different complexion and inflection and complexion, because those ducks now are really involving Holden imagining what happens to him when it freezes, which is exactly where this novel begins with Holden.
Right. Right. Yeah, I was gonna say then we get into that kind of the fire and ice at the beginning of the book. He talks a lot in that first chapter about how cold, he's freezing. He's watching the football game from the hill and freezing um
And let's think about that, because, okay, speaking of vertical axis, all of a sudden he's on a hill.
mhm,
And what's he doing? He's looking down. Now,
mhm.
again, we got to think with images. But look, if we're not paying attention to the details, if we're just saying, okay, it's kind of a smart alecky kid that's a misfit at school, we just turned it into a generalization. Well, we just missed the novel. Okay, because the novel's trying to tell us something in images, and the cold weather is a big deal, and the fact that he's up on the hill, and then he's looking down, and he's the only body on the hill. Now we're thinking, we're thinking in images, and you just see this body cut off from all the other bodies.
And he says, I felt like I was sort of disappearing.
There you go. I
Yeah.
mean, he's lost his body. If we have a body that is more than our biological body, this takes us back to marriage. You see what I mean? If I get, if, let's say I lose my husband or wife of these number of years, I feel like I lost my body.
Mhm.
Now, if we just expand this marriage to include a community of people, and I'm going to give you this analogy because the book deals with it. This whole novel takes place at Christmas time,
Mhm.
and one of the reoccurring images and words and sounds is dough. Holden is running out of dough. Now, this dough, we got to think imagistically here. That's the kind of bread, and you make bread out of wheat. So, bread is something that is a combination of nature, and you add the leaven that causes the yeast to rise. And then you get something that is a little bit natural and a little bit unnatural, because you don't get bread to rise without the human artifice. Okay, now why does all this matter? Well, it matters if we're thinking in images and joining bodies. What's going on at Christmas? Christmas, as the word sounds, as the word sound, is Christ and Mass. So at Mass, what do you do at Mass? We're speaking now of natural history, Mass. We're talking about bodies now. Okay, what happens at communion? Everyone walks in the church. They've been living separate lives in the real world. They go to church. They take bread and they eat bread. They go and sit back down, but this bread is not normal bread. This bread is the body of Christ. Now, whether or not anybody has any religious investment in this at all,
Mhm.
it doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter for the novel, really. But the images do matter, because the book is dealing with these images. So if this doesn't interest us, then the book really doesn't interest us. Okay, so now everyone's sitting down, but they all got a part of the same body inside of them now in these pews, and they're not just living separate lives like they were when they came into the church. They're now all one body. They have been joined by bread. They have been caught in the rye.
Hmm.
And this is what you said in your introduction, that literature can bring us together. Was we all read this book, let's say, and then we
Mhm.
all go sit down in the pew and we got a little bit of that book in each of us. Now, the neat thing about this book, because it's not a religion, is that there is no pope, which means there is no one that gets the last word. There is no one that can exercise authority other than imaginative contribution. In other words, we can all be on the same team working together, as opposed to creating some kind of dominant subordinate hierarchy, which is one of the excuse me, other unfortunate things about nature, at least with mammals. So we could think, humans either going to live in a dog eat dog world like the rest of these animals, or we're going to take our animal nature and figure out how to bring ourselves into a community that's not a wolf pack or that doesn't have a pecking order. Well, the only way we can do that is if we use our imaginations to imagine a different way to be a community than wolves and chickens. where do we get those kinds of where how do we exercise and grow that kind of imagination? Well, now we're getting into what this literature business is all about.
Well, and it's interesting what you were talking about with the communion. Then it makes me think back at the end of the book again when he's at the carousel with Phoebe. She had given him her money, right? The
Oh,
dough, her dough.
yeah,
And he buys her the ticket and then he gives her dough back.
there you go.
So
Wow.
there's that
Yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful. Now you're
exchange of dough.
that is wonderful. I never thought about it that way, but as you put it that way, it's absolutely perfect. And the ticket becomes important here because the word symbol comes from a word symbolon. It's a Greek word, symbolon, which really is half a ticket, a symbolon. And so the way you get in something is you get the two halves of the ticket and you put it together. So the fact that what you just described, the book specifies she gives
Hmm.
him, okay, and
Hmm.
then he gives it back. So
Hmm.
you're paying attention. That's something that escaped me. So this is wonderful. I'm learning here, and that the fact that this is taking place with a ticket being mentioned.
Hmm.
Now, someone could say, "But come on, guys, do you think J.D. Salinger thought about symboling and a ticket and dough?" Well, I got to. Here's one way to answer that. It's a great question because this
Hmm.
stuff really does blow our mind. It seems supernatural. It
Hmm.
seems like, oh my gosh, that's too amazing to be true. So that tells us we're in the place of something amazing. So that's a good
Hmm.
reason to ask that question. But we could also say regarding our dreams, if you ever had a dream and you thought, who in the world could have made that up?
Hmm.
And the point of fact is, you did. Because I don't know anybody, unless you were sleeping with somebody very, very close to you, you made it up. And the
Hmm.
fact that you can't imagine that you made it up should tell us something about our imagination. So I don't know if J.D. Salinger intended that, but J.D. Salinger didn't write this book. Okay. This imagination for which J.D. Salinger is the empirical body of wrote this book.
Right. Well, and we've talked about before, this comes up, I feel like a lot in these discussions, is that writers are readers. So JD Salinger,
Yes.
in theory, he's taken in all of those things, a lot of myth and metaphor, and those have all come together in this story for him, where he's bringing in all of those things, and
That is wonderful because how could Salinger thought of all those things? Just like you just said, because Salinger was a careful reader.
mhm,
He caught these connections from, and he's explicit about it in
mhm,
this book, right? He even tells us the authors he likes, and he tells us why he likes them. And if
mhm,
you want to think mythologically, what is it about a writer that he likes? He likes a writer that you feel like you're friends and you could call them up.
mhm,
Okay, now think about all the things going on there. We were talking about above the world and beneath the world. You can think about when you die, you go down. And now you're thinking about, okay, mass, and you're going to call somebody up. Well, what is that? That's a kind of resurrection. You're going to call somebody up. And what is Holden thinking about this whole novel? He's going to call somebody up. And he
mhm,
does call some people up. Okay, now do you see how this novel's thinking in
mhm.
image?
Well, and that leads to kind of the other thing we've touched on, we touched on in the literature was, or the lecture was the idea of how much this book is about touch and connections. And you get that a little bit with the exchanging of the dough with the sister, and she kisses him at one point, and that's kind of, again, that's right there at the end with his kind of breakthrough. But that he's trying to make connections. And we've talked about with the catcher, he misses a lot, the catcher in the rye, and he spends a lot of his book missing the connection. um
And what's the last sentence? If you ever start telling somebody, you start missing
yep,
everybody.
yep,
Now
everybody.
let's think about what an author is trying to do in terms of their aspirations as it relates to calling things up. Let's say that Shakespeare said the lover, the lunatic, and the poet are of all one imagination compact. And what Shakespeare meant by that is the lover and the lunatic and the poet all have something in common. They are all crazy enough to believe that two things can become one. They're crazy enough to believe in this thing called love. They're okay. This is what these three sad sacks have in common. They believe in impossible things. So one thing a poet could believe in is that death doesn't get the last word, which that would take quite of imagination to imagine that these people, including Allie, that in the empirical world have died are not gone.
Mhm.
So you could imagine a poet might say, you know what? I'm going to call them up. I'm going to write something so real that it's going to catch even the people who are physically not here. I'm going to call their spirits up. I'm going to catch all of this. You see, poets, in other words, are in a kind of a contest with time.
Mhm.
Poets work for eternity, and poets don't believe that clock time is the only time there is.
Mhm.
And then they write books that bear witness to the possibility of another dimension of time that our ordinary consciousness misses.
So it's interesting because he talks about Ollie and Ollie's mitt, and what does Ollie's mitt have written on it? Poems, poetry. And he obviously hasn't let go of this brother. This brother is very much alive to him still. He's kept him alive with him throughout. um hmm.
That's look, you should be an English teacher because the kind of conversation you're having now is the kind of conversation that a kid in his high school seat comes out of a seat with enthusiasm for reading because light bulbs go off, or as I saw your face beam up, all of a sudden things that had been dismembered in your imagination came together in a gestalt.
Hmm.
You just had an epiphany. I could see it on your face.
Hmm.
You all of a sudden things came together. Okay, well, this means your imagination is marrying things in a new combination that has more meaning than the newspaper and the history book and the
Hmm.
biography book that we talked about. And when, often this is so hilarious. Uh, People will say, often this is a men problem. They don't read fiction because they're only interested in things that are real. Now, what's funny about that is if you think of the conversation that we're having right now, you could say, well, actually, you're not interested in things that are real enough. Okay.
Hmm.
You're interested in horsing around. You're interested in things that are real in a kind of superficial way. And novels would agree with you that they're interested in something else. They would disagree with you that it was less real.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and really, I mean, in a lot of ways, like, what is more real than a 17-year-old who's obviously struggling with growing up, right? Doesn't want to let go of his childhood, doesn't want to let go of this brother that's died, is dealing with how to deal with that and how to thaw out enough to be able to have connections with people in the world, and isn't finding those connections at the school, or is but isn't really making them. I mean, that is all very real world. So,
That
but it
absolutely. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, but it's the messy kind of real world. It's not the facts and data, and that's where I think the nonfiction.
Yeah, okay, so that's wonderful. Let's think of the way you just put it. So the guy, let's say this make-believe guy, and I'm thinking really of Tom and Tom Daisy's husband, Tom Buchanan, because he's one of these kind of guys, right? But anyway, let's say a guy like old Tom, he wants to understand what's going on at that high school and he's going to get the facts. So he's going to get the demographics. He's going to go to the school board. He's going to look at their budget. He's going to see the SAT scores in the last 15 years. He's getting down to the getting down. Okay, he's going to get. He don't want to. Now, what's going on? Where does high school get lived? It gets lived with this goofy kid with pimples, who's really worried that the football star is maybe sleeping with the high school cheerleader that he's in love with, but the football star doesn't even really know her first name. In other words, the guy that's going to be like Tom Buchanan and get down to the real story is going to completely miss where high school happens. And
Yeah,
this is what the poet's not going to miss.
right.
You remember we talked to Tim O'Brien and he talked
Hmm.
about the details and the way he was describing the different shades of green. I remember him talking
Hmm.
about you're looking out there and there's different shades of green. Well, that's a commitment to not missing anything. If
Hmm.
you're not going to miss a shade of green, But that's very different than calling up McNamara and getting the death count for the day.
Mhm.
All these people
Mhm.
in Washington, they're going to get to the bottom of this war with infinite sort of statistics. But then there's a soldier over in Nam that's working out the different hues of green in the
Mhm.
jungle.
Mhm.
Who's getting to the real
Right.
world?
Well, and they all of the Tim O'Brien, they talk about I think Tim O'Brien, I think the oh, what was Tony, was it Tony,
Toni
did we,
Morrison?
Toni Morrison, was she the other one who talked about
Yeah.
truth? And
Okay.
then and Ursula Le Guin, they all talk about, and Ursula Le Guin was the one about, I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm a liar. I'm going to tell you the truth because it's all the story is what is telling the truth, not the
Wonderful.
facts and the data
Wonderful.
and the
Wonderful. And Holden says the same thing, right? That he's such a liar, and he does make up these incredible stories, including calling himself Jim Steele. But we're paying attention to the words now. And why did he say Jim Steele? Well, we're going back to that calling up, right? Call can also be the call, the amniotic sac. Okay, there's
Mhm.
a kind of museum around your head. That's that snow globe. Okay, if you're steel, you're also not touching. In other words, steel can be a metaphor like ice. So he is Jim Steele. So he's lying, but he's telling her who he really is.
Right.
And speaking of Allie, now when you said it just a minute ago, all of a sudden I heard the word all, because Holden is really interested in you all and all. How many times do you say and all? This relates to everybody. If you're going to call them all up. You're not going to miss anybody.
Mhm.
And now this also takes us back to Tim O'Brien and things they carry, right? With uh, Marianne Bell,
Mhm.
who is going to go into the jungle and she turns into, oh, now she's got green eyes and not blue, and she's going down. And at one point, he mentions that she was joining,
Mhm.
joining. So Marianne Bell is on a joining mission to join everybody.
Mhm.
Now, the rest of these soldiers that are imbibing this ideology thinks that there's two sides, the good team and the bad team. But all of a sudden, Marianne Bell seems to have gone native or rogue, and she's going to join everybody, which must mean that she's seeing through the ideology that says we're two different bodies.
Well, and that plays into the Ursula Le Guin book we read, where it was the bot, where the two different, the male and the female were joined in one body.
Isn't that something? Now we're getting
Mhm.
into stuff, and then that would take you right back to Adam and Eve, where man
Mhm.
and woman were joined in one body
Right.
before the fall. And what are we saying here? We're saying one thing, I think, is that these books are in conversation with each other,
Mhm.
but they're in a conversation in a form of language that we might not be speaking if we're not willing to learn the language. Tim O'Brien has the listening post. Going
Mhm.
out to the listening post where you learn how to hear. If we aren't willing to listen to the way literature communicates, if we just say, look, this is going to communicate like other books communicate, and that's the end of the story. And if you start to talk about symbolism, I'm going to say, do you really think the author intended that? And then I'm going to derail the whole conversation because we're not going to talk like that here. Well, if that's what you say, either consciously or unconsciously, when you pick up a book, you're going to miss the book. You won't have picked it up at all. You would have said, you know what? You know how I read? I project the things that interest me into pages, like white pages. I project my interest into them, and then I read it back to myself. And if I like the way I did this, then that's a good book. If I don't feel like it's easy to do that, it's not a good book.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And unfortunately, this is what many book clubs, I'm not talking book clubs because I love the idea we're going to get together and read, but very often we're going to neither get together and we're neither going to read.
Right.
We're going to maybe, if we get together, a lot of book clubs is because there was wine there, and that helped us. Okay. And
Yes.
you know what? That may have been the most meaningful part of the whole evening because the book wasn't serving us in that way.
Well, and I do feel like, and maybe this is getting into other things, but I do feel like it is getting harder and harder to listen
Yeah.
in our society, that listening is becoming very difficult and that people aren't listening to hear or comprehend or understand, but they're usually listening to reply.
Yeah. Well, and you're an optimistic, well-rounded person. I have days when I'm not. And on those days, I think it's a bit more sinister than that because I think the entire sort of social, let's say, media is designed to keep communication from happening. In other words, I think its purpose is to keep us as two different bodies. Like speaking of what Tim is learning and what Jimmy Cross is learning, or the different soldiers that have breakthroughs. They learned that the stuff that they learned back home wasn't really the way it is when you get over to Nam. And then they come back and they can't share their story because everybody back, okay, well, it's a little bit like that our media is designed to give us illusions so that we don't get together in a body that is actually not a pyramid or a pecking order or a wolf pack. Do you see? I'm saying that the discourse of the media is designed to keep us in a dog eat dog world. And I'm just guessing, and we don't have to go any further in this direction, but I'm guessing that that is profitable to do that, or
Right.
otherwise it wouldn't be. So this brings us back to the dough and a different kind of money. Now, this is where Salinger is really playing with that dough, right? Because that dough is a kind of thing that joins people too, but not like a dollar. It joins us without us having to tear each other apart or for one of us to defeat the other. Remember when he calls this hilarious? He calls this lady up that's the Princeton. What is her name?
Is it Sally or
Well, not Sally. No, this is the
no?
woman that he learned that was kind of like she's a cabaret dancer. His buddy said she wasn't exactly a prostitute and all. Oh, what's her name? Well, anyway, he calls her up, and the name that he make believe name he called him Jim Steele, but on this occasion he calls himself Edmund Birdsell. Now, this is hilarious. In the whole chapter, incidentally, she calls him Caffle with Cawff. She meant, okay, now that's a caw, so that's a bird. He says bird cell. And then at the end, he said, I really fouled that up, and fouls a bird too. So that whole little section is all about birds. But in any case, what does that have to do with dough and communion and money? Well, you can think of money that is fake way of joining people, let's say in an economic transaction that causes us to be in a pecking order, or you can think that the dough joins us, which means, in other words, this is a kind of currency too, but it's a currency that feeds us. In other words, I said that myth puts it in a world above the real world and a world beneath the real world. Well, in some ways, then a dough is the currency in the world that's more real than real. It's a different kind of, when you say the economy, you're talking about how do people organize themselves. Well, what if we organize ourselves in the way that happens in communion with a God that feeds us so that we're not starving and we have to compete with each other for crumbs. And crummy is another big word he uses quite a bit in this novel. It's a crummy. Why is he doing this? Why is it catching the rye? These are all things that relate to bread and communion.
Good stuff.
This is good stuff.
Good
And
stuff.
again, it's as good as we're willing to learn the language that it speaks in.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much
Yes. Thank you.
well, thank you for envisioning this whole reading for life thing as a possibility. And not everyone in a position of decision making power, and I mean that by being the head librarian in this case, not everybody that has that kind of decision making authority decides to do a project like this.
Yeah.
One, it might not be profitable. And two, you'd have to really love literature and not just be kind of thinking about putting up a little thing about loving literature.
Yeah.
So that says something about you and this library that I just want to acknowledge that. And the fact that you're KSMQ, is this the local?
Yep.
Okay.
KSMQ, yes. Yep.
The fact that you have a station that is willing to share this or broadcast this tells me something about your community more generally that makes me think it's a very healthy place to live, or at least a place that is trying to live in a way that is not just dog eat dog world or something else like that.
Very much so. Well, thank you very much. It's time we'll get reading now on The Unbearable Lightness of Being is our next book. So we can get moving on that one and see what connections we can make by bringing in another book to this collection that I think we're going on. This will be book number 10 that we've done.
How about that?
We
Well,
got a
it's
nice collection.
been a joy learning with you and learning with these authors. It's just really, it's one of the things I look forward to in my life. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. We'll see you all soon.
See you later.